We've got a great group of people here supporting us today and who've been working on this program. So thank you all for attending. All right, so we do have several objectives and topics on our agenda for today. As Nancy mentioned, this is our pre-administration training. So we're mainly going to be talking about things you do to prepare for testing. So making sure your devices are set up with the secure testing browser app, making sure that the map growth system is set up with all the users that you need, understanding those user roles, making sure that you have your test windows set and any test restrictions set to prevent retesting, to make sure you're having students not taking multiple tests. We want to make sure they're having a good experience. And then, of course, we're going to cover student rostering, making sure that you understand how to download that nwea roster export, where Andy is going to help give a little bit more detail. And then also how to make sure you add your student state IDs to the system, as those are going to be required and enforced by the system. And then we've got a few other topics that Nancy will cover near the end about policy. And then we also just want to make sure everyone knows how they can reach out to NWEA support in our help desk if they have any questions. And then we also want to provide a chance for Q&A. I'm taking a quick look at the way this room is set up. So I don't directly see a Q&A option. Normally we ask that you use that, but in lieu of that, you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat. That'll make sure we can gather all of those questions, create an FAQ for any questions we can't answer today, but of course we'll do our best to answer any questions we can near the end of the presentation. Okay, I think that covers our agenda. Let's go ahead and jump in. So here we go. So yeah, here today we're going to be talking about the map growth assessment in Maine, which subjects are required, which grades are participating, all of that. As far as which tests are required, so we mentioned the subjects, but I want to give a chance for everyone to see the names of the tests that you're going to see in the map growth system. So if you're going in there making any configurations or setting up your test sessions, these are what you're going to see. So they're going to be the Maine 2020 versions. Everyone should have been updated to these new test versions as of this academic year. So there's going to be Math 2 through 5, 6+, Reading 2 through 5, 6+, and then Language 2 through 12. We also do want to mention that there are accessible versions of the tests available, and those in particular are needed for students who are using any refreshable Braille keyboards as they're taking the assessment. By default, these are not switched on because they are a different test form with slightly different content to be more applicable to those students with those needs. So if you do have any students in your district that will need that test, just please reach out to our partner support team and we can make that test available for you. And then you can assign that test to those students. And we'll have the contact information at the end of this presentation. All right, we do just kind of want to go over some scheduling guidance as well. So just in general, we have typical test times for map growth tests. So in general, even though the tests are different subjects and have different content, they typically take students 60 minutes to complete. They're not timed tests though. So students don't have a timer. They're not going to get kicked out if they take too long. They can be paused for breaks and resume later in the day or at a later day as well. And we do recommend not having students take more than one test in a day. We don't want to have them get fatigued. That's not going to be them giving their best effort if they're feeling too exhausted. And then if you look along the left, you can see the number of questions for each test. And in general, since it is an adaptive test and the items are determined as the student is moving forward in the test, sometimes students will see a different number of items. All right, so there are also several student resources available and practice tests. So we definitely recommend, if students haven't had a chance to take map growth or just in general to get them prepared, that students go in and take one of these practice tests. So they can be accessed via the secure browser, which we'll talk about in a moment, that application students log in from, but they can actually be taken through the web browser as well. So whatever is easier for you when you're doing your practice testing day, you can go through either option. We definitely recommend using the secure browser. That's just a good way to test the applications installed, that your devices are up to date and have all the latest updates, and that things will go smoothly on testing day. And there are login credentials for the practice test. It's just going to be username and password, grow and grow, all lowercase. We also do have some other student resources available. So there's a tutorial video students can watch, just general test taking tips that are applicable to everyone, and a few other things. And that's going to be available at studentresources.nwea.org. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about the technology requirements so that you can make sure students have the devices they need and can get the application installed. So first of all is going to be the NWEA Secure Testing Browser. As you see that icon here, there are 2 NWEA apps now. There's a newer one that we released, but you're going to want to continue using the same app that you've been using for map growth testing this whole time. For those of you who are new to map growth, you'll see that picture there. It's that black and yellow icon. So we also, Maine Department of Ed and NWEA both strongly recommend using the secure testing browser whenever you're testing students. So if at all possible, please install the app and have them go through the app. There's a few benefits to this. The main thing is that it does lock the test down so that the students can't minimize the window, they can't go online and Google things while they're testing. So for the best, most accurate results and to maintain that test security, please ensure you have that secure browser installed and that students are testing from that browser. The only exceptions to that is if there are schools who are testing remotely where students need to have software such as Zoom or other conference software to be able to communicate with the proctor. That secure browser does lock them down to that one application, so they aren't able to move between the two. So there may be situations where you would need to test outside of the browser in those scenarios, but outside of those scenarios, please use the browser. Then also, the secure browser is compatible with the following devices. So same as always, Windows PCs, Mac computers, iPads, and Chromebooks. Here we've got a little more detail about which devices are compatible and which operating system versions are compatible. As you see at the bottom, we also have a link to the Map Growth System and Technology Guide. So that's just in the help section. You can go there at any time from the Map Growth page with that help link at the top right, and then just see the most up-to-date system requirements. So to quickly cover those, for Windows, you'll need to be on Windows 10 or newer. For Mac, it's going to be Mac OS 10.14 as a minimum. For Chromebook, we recommend you keep your Chromebooks updated, but the minimum version that is supported is going to be Chrome OS 87. And then for iPads, iOS 13 at a minimum is supported. There's a few other things we want to cover as well. So for screen resolution, depending on your device, you will need to have a resolution of 1024 by 768 for students. For any scaling or zoom settings, we just want to have those on their default of 100%. If students do need any type of zoom accommodation, that's built into the assessment. So before opening the app, you just want to have the screen size set to the default of 100%, so things aren't cut off the screen. And then for color depth, 32-bit is recommended. So if you do encounter any issues with these, you may see an error when opening the secure browser, but it'll point out to you which one of these settings is incorrect, so you can go in and change it. And then in addition to that, we've got some bandwidth requirements as well. So essentially for students in grades 3+ testing, which would be all the students in this program, you'd need 2 megabits per second for every 30 computers that's concurrently testing. And also it's good to keep in mind that there's an initial load when you first start the test where it's loading more information than it does throughout the remainder of the test. So if you are having any bandwidth or connectivity issues, it may be good to kind of stagger your student logins rather than them all logging in at the same moment, spread it out a little bit so that it's not loading too much all at once. We've also got some recommendations for wireless access points. So in general, we'd recommend 25 devices per wireless access point. If you're more than that, 25 through 50, you may want to do some testing. Again, you can do the practice tests or find other ways to test out that scenario. And then if there's 50 or more devices on one wireless access point, we would recommend you try to decrease the number of devices so you don't end up with any loading issues or students getting kicked out or disrupted during their test. And then I know this is a lot of information, but we just wanted to briefly show you there are some allow lists that you'll want to go in and make sure are set up on your network filters or firewalls. Okay, so moving on from technology, we're going to go into platform settings. So this covers things like user roles, assigning and creating users, making sure everyone has their proper logins, and then as well as a few other settings such as setting your test windows, making sure that your retest settings are set. And we recommend all district assessment coordinators or system admins go in and configure these settings just to keep testing going smoothly. All right, so first of all, we want to cover user management. So pretty straightforward, but just to kind of take it from the top. So access to map growth for users is granted via user profiles. Users can have one or many roles assigned, which determine which permissions they have in the system. The role of system administrator is the first one that's created and who creates all the other users in the system. And then users can be created manually just through the website or via that CSV file upload, which we'll cover how to do that. And also there was recently some guidance sent out by Maine DOE on user cleanup. We did see, and we kind of see in general that there can be a lot of turnover for staff within schools and districts, and not all of the users always get their roles removed or changed or have those profiles deleted. So please refer to that guidance so you can go in and make sure anyone who has left has been removed, just to make sure all of the data in the system stays secure. All right, so we want to just cover some instructions on how to go in and manually create users. A lot of you have already done this, so it may be a refresher. But essentially, the three roles that can create user accounts are going to be system administrators, data administrators, and district assessment coordinators. For creating in bulk, data administrators have an option to import a file that will allow them to create users or assign user roles in bulk. The template on how to do that is available on that Map Administration and Reporting Center page, otherwise known as MARC, which is the page you're seeing here on the right. That's that default page you first see when you log in. And then as far as the additional users template to import in bulk, if you look at the bottom right corner under that administrator setup box, it's going to be under download roster file template. And then within that file, there's going to be a tab for the additional users template. And then if you look along the top left of the image, there's that manage users link. So if you just need to go in and edit or create a user one at a time, you have that option to do so there if you're one of those three roles on the left. So as far as how to go in and manually create, so along the left, you would just go to manage users. You'll see that blue button to go in and create a user. And honestly, it's pretty straightforward. Once you click on that, you'll notice that there are fields with that red asterisk which are required. So first of all, you'll need to create a username for your user account. We always recommend just using the user's email as their username, since the usernames need to be unique. If you try to put in John Smith, someone's probably already taken it from another district, so the email's the best bet. And then also filling out that email address field. That'll make sure if they need to reset their password, there's a way for us to send that to them. Then, of course, you want to put in their first name and last name and any other fields with that star. Then we get to the point of user roles. So we want to take a moment to clarify all of the user roles and permissions that exist. So when you're on this screen, you'll see along the left, you can select which roles you want to add and click the add button, and then that'll move them over to that roles to assign section. So as you'll see, there's a few here that we're going to cover. So there's system administrator, there's both district and school assessment coordinators, there's data administrators, and then there's both school and district proctors. So first of all, we want to cover user roles that have to do with map setup. So setting up the system, creating other users, things like that. These roles are primarily used for setting things up. So for example, the system administrator role, if you look in that left column there, you'll see the different functions that they have access to. And along the bottom in that blue section where it says map menus, that'll actually show which links they'll have on the left of that MARC site. So you'll be able to see what access they have to the system. So really for system administrator, only a few leaders should have access to this, since this role does allow you to create other users and grant access to any part of the platform. So it's good to only have a few people or even one person with this role. Then leaders in charge of the assessment usually use the district assessment coordinator role. That also lets them create other users. They can do things like view operational reports to track testing progress, to see what students have been rostered, and to see what users exist in the system. They'll be able to go in and reset passwords for other users and then modify preferences, which we'll cover a little later too. And they can also do things like edit the testing window and mark testing complete when it's done. And then the third role here that we're covering on this slide is the data administrator role. Their primary function is to import the rosters to add students to the system. So they have the ability to add and edit student profiles, edit users. They can also view operational reports to track that progress throughout the window. And then they could do things like merge students, reassign test events in the cases of any administration errors that they need to go in and correct. So those are roles for setting up the system. Next, we want to move on to roles for testing students. So these three roles are going to be the school proctor or the district proctor, and then the school assessment coordinator. So for users who are just going to administer tests, they can generally use the school proctor role. That would give them access to test any students within their school. There's another role, which is the district proctor role. So that gives them that same access, but across the district. So if you do have someone who maybe goes between different schools, or you just have someone who you'd like them to go in and create and manage the test sessions for multiple schools, then they can have that district proctor role. They'd be able to create sessions at all those buildings, and then the school proctors could go in and use those sessions when testing day comes. And then the school assessment coordinator role, it's pretty similar to the district assessment coordinator, but they can't add students or users, but they can go in and view operational reports, and they can help do some of those other functions that would let them oversee testing and track the testing progress. Then the third and final category of user roles that we want to talk about is users that have access to student reports and viewing and using the data. So in general, teachers who are assigned to classes in the system are going to have that instructor role. That'll allow them to view student results for students assigned to their classes. They'll be able to view individual student and class reports. And then for those using it, they'd have access to map skills to view students and register them there. Then principals and other school leaders typically use the role that's just called administrator. So I know there's a couple roles with that in the title. This one is just called administrator on its own. And what that does is it would give that user access to view all student results at that school. So sometimes there are maybe intervention teachers or special education teachers who need to have access to different students throughout the school or throughout the district. Sometimes it's applicable to use that role as well, because then they could go in and look at whoever they need. But please make sure that you verify that you're giving the users the right level of access and not more than they need to see. And then in addition, those other two roles we already covered, school and district assessment coordinator, they do also get full reports access. So district would be able to see reports for any students, classes, or grades, or schools in their district, while the schools get that same information just at their individual school level.
Can I jump in here for a second, Alex?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say, I'm not talking about my own school district here, but over time, those of us who've been using NWA for many years created roles or assigned roles to users. For example, a school psychologist might need to see some data for a number of kids, right? And I highly encourage people to go back and look at some of their older users, because previously some of these data specific roles didn't exist. And so some of us, out of necessity, maybe assigned too many operational roles to users. So I highly encourage you to go, and I'll paste the link on a way to modify and search for users and do a little cleanup. I'm not going to say we had 25 people with too many roles, but I'm saying there are districts with many people with way too much access to the operational side and to the data. So I highly encourage you, especially legacy NWA users, to go and spend about an hour cleaning that up.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, and just like you said, there are a few resources within the system to help you identify that. There's an operational report just called user roles that you can pull, which will show which users have which roles assigned. So that can be a good way to just get a list and then confirm if anyone does have too much access, or if maybe their position in the school or district has changed and you want to get that updated to reflect their new role. All right, so now that we've covered the user roles, I do want to talk about how to create and edit users in bulk. So as I mentioned before, there is that roster file template available on the Mark page, that kind of map growth homepage once you log in. Within that template, there are some columns that are required. So for this one, there's not too much that's required to create and edit users. You'll just need to make sure you have their last name, first name, their username they'll use to log in, which we always recommend just using their email, and then their actual email for password resets. And then within this template, columns J through Q are going to have the different roles listed. So you could add a Y into the column there to assign that role when you import the file. You can also do all of it manually, but if you're trying to do it in bulk and save some time, this is a great option. And then as far as how to go in and import the file. So we're going to talk about user imports as well as student imports. They go through a very similar process and they're done from the same part of the website. So you might see this repeated a couple of times. It might be a little familiar. We just want to make sure it's very clear. So essentially, you'd go to that import profiles rostering link at the top left, and you would have to be a data administrator to have access to that link. In this case, where you see roster type in that middle screen, you'll need to choose the additional users option and then click on add to locate your CSV file and import it. Then once you do that, you'll see that it's hosting data in progress. It'll take some time to do that. Usually just takes a couple minutes. If you're doing a large number of users or a really large file, it can take up to an hour. And after it's been processing for a while, you'll see that it was successful. Then next, we want to move on to setting your test window. Students need to be tested within these dates to be considered participating in the program. And also, essentially, only tests taken within this time frame are going to be reported back to the main Department of Ed. So you want to make sure that you schedule around these dates and that you go into the system and configure this as your test window, which we'll show in a moment. And then kind of just repeating what I said. So system administrators and district assessment coordinators are the ones who have to go in and edit that test window and make sure the time frame shown above is set. And there may be instances where districts want to test outside of the state program, or maybe have been using map growth for a while and have their own ways of testing that are a little different. So they can test outside of these dates because only tests within these dates are going to be pulled and provided as part of the program.
Alex, can I jump in here quickly? Because
Sure.
someone asked in the chat, can we have the windows set for the broader K to 12 and 9? Because if you test any of those students that need to take that as the assessment during that time outside of that window, those results are not coming to the main DOE.
Great, thanks for clarifying that, Nancy. Okay. All right, so hopefully that's pretty clear. We'll move on and we'll show how you can go in and set those dates. All right, so again, it's pretty straightforward once you know where to go, and you need to have that system administrator or district assessment coordinator role to make this change. So along the left, you can click on modify preferences, and then the manage terms link will appear in that list below. So once you click that, you'll get a list of all your academic years, and then you'll see the terms. And then you'll notice that there are both term dates and then test window dates. Something else to keep in mind is you want to make sure to go in and set the proper number of weeks of instruction before testing, depending on when in that window you're going to have your students test. So that's going to be the number of weeks from the beginning of your school year, maybe a little different for different districts if you start at different times, but that's going to help give you the most accurate data. That'll make sure that essentially, since our reports are norms-based and comparing students to their peers, it'll make sure that it's comparing your students to students who performed similarly, who had similar weeks of instruction and who were in the same grade, subject, all of that. So this will help make sure those percentile rankings and those comparisons are accurate. And then also just we recommend that you have it apply to every school in the district when you click save. That way there aren't any schools who have a different window and that everyone is within this time frame. So as Nancy mentioned earlier, and I mentioned as well, there are some districts that may test outside of the window. There may be a few reasons, such as, you might test students with special accommodations that aren't permitted as part of the state program. There may be parent retest requests outside of the program, things like that. So you can still test outside of those window dates. But keep in mind, any tests that are taken outside of the testing window, they're only going to appear on the following reports. So there's the class report, the grade report, and in both of those, you'll see that outside of window test appear in gray. So that'll let you know that it was outside of the window. Then the student progress report, there's an option to choose all valid tests from the list there, and then that'll get those outside of window results pulled into that report. And then of course you can always pull the comprehensive data file that will just pull all of the tests taken within that term. So you'll see ones taken outside of the window. There's a column that shows growth measure YN, and that'll show false. That'll be your clue that it was outside of the window and that it's not going to be reported to the state. All right, we also do want to talk about retesting students in map growth because we know there may be legitimate situations where students need the opportunity to test again. In general, though, students should only take one map growth assessment once per term each, so one in each of the applicable subjects. And in general, if you do retest a student without a valid reason, it's just not a great experience for the student having to sit through the test again, and it's not really going to provide a better score. The way the test is adaptive, they're not going to see the same questions, they're going to be seeing all different items. So there's not really a benefit to the student's score to have them try taking the test again. And there may be instances where retesting is permitted. So Maine DOE has provided some guidance, which is available here via the link below and also on their map growth website on when retesting is permitted. So some examples include any students who had excessive rapid guessing where they clicked through too quickly through the test and the test was invalidated due to that. If the test was completed in an abnormally short amount of time, so just a few minutes. If improper accommodations were provided and the student needs to retest with their proper accommodations. And then of course, things like if they took the wrong grade level or wrong subject and need to retest to take the proper subject. So to kind of help support this and to prevent retesting needlessly, there's a few settings in the system you can go in to apply to set that test for once per term. So once again, system administrators and district assessment coordinators have the ability to go in and make this edit, and then they can set the test attempt to 1 per subject per student. And then there are also a couple of other restrictions available too. So you can remove access to tests that aren't used to just kind of shrink down that list that proctors are seeing so that there's not so much to sift through. A good example is the screening tests. Since these aren't going to be used as part of the program, we don't want them being administered by mistake and then the student possibly having to retest on the full form. So there's a way to go in and remove those as well. And you can also go in and make tests inaccessible to certain grade levels. In general, the system's pretty flexible. So if you wanted to assign, a third grader the 6+ test, it would let you do it. So you want to be vigilant when assigning the tests, but going in and setting some of these restrictions can help control that to prevent any improper test assignments. So going through how to do that here, once again, it's going to be along the left under that modify preferences section, and then under modify tests. Once you click that here in the middle column now, you'll see a list of all the tests available to you. Your list may be much longer, especially if you've been using map growth for a while, or if you have already been paying for other subjects or other products. So you may see a lot more in your list, but you'll essentially want to select one of these tests for the main administration, like math, language, or reading, and then edit test settings. And then along the right, that's the pop-up box that you'll see. So that first check mark along the top for active or not, that basically turns the test on or off. If that box is not checked, then the test is not going to appear available to assign to students. So you definitely want to make sure all the tests as part of the program are active. As far as term, you could go in and restrict tests so that they're only appearing by term if you'd like to. But the real feature we want to look at is that frequency down at the bottom. So we'd like you to go in and set that to once per term and assign. And then that'll make sure that proctors aren't able to have the student continue to retest. Nancy, did you have a comment?
Yeah, can I add or ask a question actually? In your middle screenshot that shows the 3 sessions that are applicable to Maine, do the users in the field still see the choice of the math, reading, and language for the appropriate grade levels with the CCSSO tag after it?
So they should not. So
Okay.
when we updated our test from the CCSSO version to the Maine aligned version, those old versions have been removed and replaced with the Maine versions. Yeah. So if for any reason you do still see those, you shouldn't. Just make sure you're using the Maine versions. And I just recommend reaching out to our help desk, but those should have all been updated. All right. And then once you go in and select once per term and assign, that'll put that test restriction in place so that students can't accidentally keep taking the same test. All right, next up, we're moving on to district and school state codes. So this is another feature that we've had in the system for a while, but to help keep data clean and aligned, we're starting to require that this get added in. So essentially, any schools in your district need to have their proper school state codes assigned. Once again, it's going to be the same roles going in and administering this. So the system administrator or district assessment coordinator. When you're importing your roster file, please keep in mind that that first column in the file, column A, is also going to be the school state code. So you'll need to make sure that that is entered in your roster properly. And as part of the features that we've implemented, if that code is missing, you'll get an error and you'll be asked to enter that code in. And then for districts that are using auto rostering solutions such as Clever, these school state codes are needing to be included in that sync. So we did meet with, I believe, all of the districts in Maine who are using Clever. We tried to pull that list and include everyone in that conversation. And we do have some great contacts with Clever themselves who've been working with us. So I think at this point, everyone in that situation has been addressed. But if you already are using Clever, then we just recommend you reach out to Clever support. They've got some quick steps where they can go in and configure the codes for you. All right, and then there is a great resource here below that Andy and Maine DOE have provided that will actually give you a list of all your most up-to-date district and school state codes. We know some districts haven't really updated those in their student information system for a while and maybe using legacy codes. So please visit that link and just make sure that you're getting the most up-to-date codes so that all of the data in your map growth system is attributed to the proper school. All right, and then as far as how to go in and make these edits. So once again, once you know where it is, it's pretty straightforward. Just like a lot of the things we've been talking about today, it's going to be under Modify Preferences there along the left. And this time it'll be under Modify District. Then if you look over, you'll see a list of all of your schools. And there's that school state code column. So you can see if it's already in there, but if it is missing, you can select the school and then click on that Edit Name and State Code button above. And then the next screen you'll be on down at the bottom right is it's going to show your school's name and then your school state code. So just update that code and click submit, and then that'll save the change for you.
I think it's important to note that if you're doing an import later, it will override that, right? So you want to make sure that your source for that number is consistent. And so there's a link you can see in the chat, and that will show you the new numbers. This goes back to 2017, the latest revision. And so what you should be looking for is a 1 to 4 digit number, and keep an eye on that. I know some of us in our old SISs from which we pull rosters, sometimes we haven't updated in our SISs. So if you're the type of person that pulls an Excel CSV to import your students and teachers, you want to make sure that you're pulling in the right field there or manually correcting it. It's pretty simple to manually correct it before you import.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, that's a really good point. So yeah, that import file will overwrite whatever has been entered here. So you want to make sure that import's correct. And if you are getting that as an extract from your student information system, just make sure that source, that SIS, has the correct codes in there. All right. Then moving on here. Actually, I do want to, I think, take a moment to address a couple questions that have popped up. So I do see someone asking about the test restrictions. If we do select a frequency to once per term and we need to retest, will that cause an issue? So there are a few options to go in and allow a student to retest. So that is restricted to one specific role, which is the data administrator. So we've got some instructions on how to do that on our website in the help section. But essentially, if there is one of those legitimate reasons where a student needs to retest, the data administrator can go in and invalidate that prior attempt and let them retest. We do want you to follow the guidance that main DOE has provided with that document to go through that proper process and make sure that the state is advised of the attempt. Do you have anything else to add, Nancy?
Yeah, I'll be covering that in the end of the presentation with my couple of slides.
Perfect. All right, more info to come. Okay, I'll take another quick look. I think a lot of the questions in chat have already been answered. So thanks, Andy and Tara. All right, and I did see someone asking, would Clever overwrite assigned roles? So Clever doesn't sync users, it just syncs students. There is one user role that it syncs, which is just the instructor role. So if you have teachers set up in there, it would assign the instructor role if they have classes, but other than that, no other roles are affected by Clever. All right, I will move on next. Okay, so next we want to talk about student rostering, which is probably going to be a big bulk of the conversation today. We want to make sure that this is clear and understood. And then, as we mentioned, there are a few changes we're making just to some of the required fields. The process itself is going to be basically the same as you're used to, but there are student state ID requirements that will be enforced in the system. So right here. So essentially, main student state IDs are now a required field when you're importing your roster file. Once again, for those using Clever, these can be synced from your SIS. We made an effort to reach out to all Clever districts and help them get that configured with Clever. If you haven't had the chance to do that yet, please reach out to Clever support and they can get that configured for you. For those who are manually rostering, when you look at the roster file template, it's going to be column O, which is that student state ID field. So you'll notice there are two fields for student ID. There's the standard student ID and then student state ID. So if you do have local district IDs that you use for your students, you can use column N, just the student ID field for those local IDs, and then use the state IDs in the state ID field. If you really don't have any local IDs and you're just using the state IDs, you can go ahead and put the state ID in both of these fields, as long as the student state ID is in column O. Honestly, you can use whatever type of ID you'd prefer for N, including just the same student state ID in both places. All right, so next we want to talk about the NEO roster file that has been made available for a while and give some instructions on how to download it, and then some instructions on how you can import that into the system. Because essentially that's going to be your source of truth for which students are required to test in your district. So kind of like I mentioned here, this is going to give you a list of all the students that the state is expecting you to test as part of the program. It does contain all the student info that's needed to import these records into the NWEA system, but it does not contain teacher and student class associations, and those must be added manually by a data administrator. So there are some instructions here. There is a document that's linked here at the bottom as well on how to go into NEO and how to export this roster file. And you do have to have a proper account. If you don't have access, you'll need to request it from your superintendent. Essentially, you'll go into student data from the dashboard menu. There's that click here to enter student reports. And there's a report that's called NWEA Mathematics and Reading. And then we have kind of a sample file here of what the actual file output looks like. So there's going to be some rows of just headings and some visuals, but then starting on line 14 is when you actually see the template. And then Andy, if there's anything you want to add to how to download it or viewing the file that you've noticed in working with it, feel free. Otherwise,
sure. Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at the file right now in Alex's view, there are some fields that are hidden. And so when you download it, it'll expand those out. You should note that columns P, Q, R, S, and T are all sort of new files that have been added in the last year. And so they make reference to things like Clever or ClassLink or other elements that are optional. But if you do not match up your headers exactly with what NWA thinks will be the import, you're going to get errors in format. So what I like to do is I copy the whole top line that is located in the downloadable template right on the Map Growth homepage, right in where you log in. It's one of the first things right smack dab middle at the bottom. And I just copy that and I paste it into a row. And then I sort of adjust the columns so they have the exact same wording. So that's my recommendation there. It makes the import go in much, much better. And there's also a bunch of, see like there at the top, there's a little bit of nice graphics and things of that nature. Make sure you clean all that stuff up too, because CSVs don't like fancy graphics.
Exactly. Great, thanks, Andy. Yeah, so just like Andy said, I'll put a link to the roster file template in the chat here. So that'll just give you a quick, easy way to access it, but it's also just available on that MARC homepage when you log in. But just like Andy mentioned, there have been a couple changes to that template. So you'll want to make sure that the header row matches what you basically want to paste the header row in from the template into this file. And then of course, make sure all of the columns are properly aligned with those headings. All right, so here is where I want to talk about some of the kind of nuances and the more specifics of importing the file. Because as I mentioned, this file is going to give you all of the students, but it doesn't contain all of the teacher and class associations. And there are a few pieces of info that are missing for this to be a complete file. So there are kind of three options for how you can go ahead and import it. And it may depend on how long you've been using MapGrowth, what your normal process is. But essentially the information that's in the file, once you match it to the right headings, it has everything that you need to do a student-only import. But as I keep stressing, it's not going to have those teacher-class associations. So you essentially can load your system with this NEO file as a student-only import. That'll get all the kids in there, but then you are required to do another full import with your classes. So if you've been using MapGrowth, you already have a process for importing, you can just do the student-only import, get that submitted successfully, and then do your regular import again with all your students and your classes. And then it'll align to the students that are already in the system, and then just add the classes to them. So you don't have to worry as long as your IDs are consistent. It's not going to duplicate anyone. It'll just allow you to add those classes in. The second option, which would require a little more manual work, would be to download that NEO roster file and then edit that file to fill in the gaps. So you could add the teacher and class information to that file. Depending on how large your school or district is, that could be a lot of manual work though. So if you already have a process in place to import your roster, you may want to do that first option of the student only and then your full roster so that it's all aligned. But if it's easier for you or your student population is small enough that you can just edit the NEO file to include all of the missing fields, then that's perfect. And then kind of the final option is more using that NEO file as a check for accuracy. So you could go through and import your roster as you normally would, but then compare your roster file with the NEO file. Make sure you have the same number of students, make sure all your SSIDs are correct and consistent between the two. And then that way you know that everyone is in the system. And we're going to cover all three of these options here in detail as well. So essentially that first option, and I'm probably going to be repeating myself here, but this is that student only roster. So when you download that NEO file, make sure that the school, state code, and school names are accurate in the file. The way that your school names are already in map growth may be a little different than the way they're coming from the NEO file. So as we've been showing, if you go to modify preferences on the left and then modify district, you can see the names of your schools. You'll want to make sure the way your schools are named in our system is the way that they are on the file, so you don't get an error. And then, as we talked about before too, several of those first rows is just some visual information. You don't really need that in the file. So you'll want to delete those rows out so that that first row in the file you're importing is the header row. And then, of course, it's going to start with that school state code, as we showed. And then I'm going to repeat it again, just want to stress it. So teacher and class information is still required to be imported. So you'll want to do a standard import after the student only import to make sure all of that information is populated. If you don't have teacher and class information in there, you will encounter issues trying to view the student results and view reports. Having a class assigned is a required attribute for a student's score to be visible in the system. So there are some operational reports you can run, like students missing testing attributes and students without valid tests. You can run those to see if there's anyone that you missed or any students that aren't assigned to a class. And then once again, once you import the students in and you do your regular roster, it'll align to the students you've already added and just add any missing information in with that secondary import. So as far as how to do the student-only roster import, so here, data administrator is the role that's needed to do this. You'd go to the top left and click on Import Profiles Rostering and click that Start New Import button. Then here you'll have a few options. So in that first selection, you want to leave it the same as a standard import. And then, of course, make sure you have the proper term selected. And then here's where you would choose Add Update Students Only. So this is only going to just create the student profiles, but there will still be those gaps you need to fill in later. Then you click on Add to select that file. Once you selected the file and continued on, it'll give you a small preview of what is in the file here. So as you're seeing in this screen on the left, it's not going to have any of that instructor information, but if you scroll to the right in that little table, you'll start seeing all the student information. So this is your chance to check that everything's in the proper column, that things haven't shifted and that they're in the proper place. Once you see that everything there looks correct, you'll click that blue confirm button, and then it'll move on to file format validation in progress. Once again, that can take a few minutes. It can take up to an hour if there's a lot of students that you're adding, but just give it some time to process, and then it would complete if it was successful. Then here you'll see the option. If there are no errors, we're kind of going down the happy path right now, but we'll cover errors in a moment too. Then you'll want to click on that Review Import Summary. It'll show you if there are any errors, and if there aren't, you'll have that button to post valid records. I do want to point out there's a link here at the bottom. Directly within the Map Growth Help section, there are a lot of resources on how to import the file and how to resolve any errors. There's actually a how-to video that'll walk you through step by step, just with a video with some narration and some visuals. So if that's easier for you, you could go through that process as you're doing your import. All right, so that would cover that first option, importing it as a student only. And then of course, you'd need to go through and import the full roster with all your teachers and classes afterwards. The second option would be to go in and essentially edit that NEO roster to add the class information in yourself. So if it's easier for you to do it that way and just do one import, you can. You want to make sure all of the teacher information is populated in those fields. So things like, first name, last name, username, email address. And then there's going to be info for the class. So essentially, the teacher information is going to be present for each line in the file they have a student assigned. So for example, if there's a teacher that has 20 students in her class, she will be listed in that file 20 times, and there will be a different student on each of those 20 lines. But what will tie them all together is that class column. So all the students would be assigned to that same class under that teacher. And then once you complete those required fields and you have this full file built out, then you can just import as a standard import with the standard add update type and not the student only. So to show how to do that, it's going to be pretty similar, but there's a few differences. Once again, you'll go to Import Profiles Rostering at the top left. You'll go in and choose the standard roster type. And then here you'll choose the standard add update. These are actually the default options, so they'll be selected here automatically. Then you add the file. Then once again, it'll show you the preview of the file. This is where you just double check the header rows do match the data so that you know nothing in your file has shifted. And once that's good, you click on confirm. It'll go through that validation once again. And then here, if there weren't any errors found, you'll have the option to review the import summary. And then post valid records is always the final step. So even if there are errors, we'll cover those in a second. Just keep in mind, once you click post valid records, that means that it's posted. And then the third option would essentially just be to roster as you normally do with your standard roster process. But then you can use the operational report that's called students by district, which will give you an export of all the students in your district. And then you can compare, basically just compare that student state ID column to the one in the NEO file and make sure all of your students are present. Also, if you just go through a regular roster process, you can just compare that roster you imported to the NEO file and just make sure all the students are there. And then if you do notice there's students missing, you can manually add them in if it's just one or two, or you can always do additional imports to add in anyone that's missing. Okay, so next up, I do want to talk about a couple of the error types that you might encounter when rostering. And as I mentioned before, the website will actually walk you through the process and give you information on the errors. But and there's a help section with videos, but just to kind of give you an overview, there's 3 different types. So the first one is a file format error. That means it didn't recognize the file at all. So it's either not a CSV file, it doesn't have the proper header row, or there's other issues with the file itself that need to be corrected. And when you see that error pop up, it'll give you some of those options. The next one is the file format was validated, but there are errors within the file. So the file is a proper CSV. It has the formatting and the header rows that it needs, but there's some inconsistencies within the file itself. Sometimes if you have a student in there multiple times, maybe they've got a different ID on one line and a different ID on another line. So it's confused which one is correct. It's usually things like that where there's just conflicting data. It'll actually point out which cell has the conflict, so you can go in and compare and make that correction and re-import the file. Then the last one is generally the easiest kind, is reconcilable errors. That means there's some inconsistencies between what's in the file and what's already in the system. So students have been imported in the past, but then what's coming in on the file is different. So it'll actually show you the 2 differences, and you can choose which data you'd like to keep moving forward and how you'd like to correct the error. So we're going to go in a little more detail with these. So the first one is file format errors. Once again, this means the file itself, it's either not a CSV, delimited format, so you might need to resave it. Sometimes people leave it in that Excel format, and that's when they'll see this error. So it does need to be resaved as a CSV, delimited. As Andy mentioned, you need to make sure all the header rows from the template are present and all the data is properly aligned to their columns. And then to correct this, you want to resave the file and try that import again from the beginning, and then that'll get you past this error. Next one up is when it's the file format was validated, but there were errors within the file. So there's basically a mismatch in data within the file itself. You'll have that button there to click review roster errors, and you'll actually get a list. So in this case, it's a little cut off, but you'll see it'll say column name, data in error, and row number. So in this case, the username column on row number 2, you can kind of use those to cross-reference. So if you know which column username is vertically, then which row number it shows, that'll take you to that cell. And then in this example, there's probably a teacher that has one line where their email had a typo in it, and it's confused because the email is not consistent for every time that teacher's in there. So you'll just need to go in and make those changes, save, and then re-import the file again, start the process over. Then the last type of error here, it's kind of nice because it'll actually walk you through these, but these are reconcilable errors. These mean that there's a mismatch in the data that's already in the system versus what's coming through on the file. So you'll have that button to click reconcile errors. And then you'll see on this third screen here, it'll list out which kind of errors there are. In this case, there's 2 student errors. So likely what's in the system and what's on the file is different. Maybe they have like an abbreviated name, maybe their ID number has changed, things like that. So you may need to go in and correct those and then choose to submit all of submit the full file once you've reconciled all of the errors. Something to mention, for those of you who have not yet been using student state IDs or using local IDs, as you go through, there may be many students that need to have their IDs updated. So what you can do if you're seeing a lot of reconcilable errors for your students and it's too time consuming to go in one by one, then you can use that previous student ID column to essentially put in their old IDs from prior and then put their new IDs in the student ID column, and that'll automatically update those. And we've got those instructions available at that link below. So if you find yourself in that scenario, there are a few options so you're not manually clicking through every student. All right, so that essentially covers the import process. So covering how to get that NEO roster, how to import the file, how to go through getting your students populated in the system. And we wanted to kind of have that be our focus of this pre-administration training.
The main specific number is 855.
Thank you.
430
Mhm.
1777. I'm going to paste that in. You definitely want to call that main specific number because sometimes you'll explain and then you'll get forced to be rerouted. So take a look in the chat.
Thank you, Andy.